Hey, what's going on, gang? Nate on the Stone here. Welcome back to my channel. Last week, if you remember, I made a rather bold claim here on YouTube. I do not think that there is anything that we can do outside of an actual, honest-to-God revolution, for which the tube has started to take retaliatory measures by actually hiding my channel. So, just as a reminder, when you subscribe to the channel, make sure you ring that bell like Quasimodo so that you will know when I actually post videos, new videos here on the channel. But my claim from last week still needs to be hashed out a bit, which is why this week we're looking at a very specific question. When is a revolution actually justified? And have we ourselves actually reached that point? The most famous answer to that question probably comes in the prologue of the Declaration of Independence, wherein Thomas Jefferson wrote, quote, "Prudence indeed will dictate that all experience hath shown that mankind is more disposed to suffer while evils are sufferable than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed." In other words, just because our preferred candidate didn't win election, just because our taxes were raised, just because an idiotic, or even worse, unjust law was passed, that doesn't mean that we're justified in taking out our guns and going out onto the streets before getting down to business and drafting an entirely new system of government. Jefferson goes on in the Declaration's prologue to say when a revolution is actually justified. But when a long train of abuses and usurpations pursuing invariably the same object evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government and provide new guards for their future security. This is exactly what happened in 18th century America. At the conclusion of the French and Indian War, the British Parliament began taking a much more active interest in its North American holdings and began, for example, taxing the colonists directly. Parliament also began curbing the smuggling that was happening all along the 3,000 miles of Atlantic coastboard, something that cut into royal revenue, FYI. Parliament did this by passing the writs of assistance, which were basically blank warrants that gave revenue officials the power to board and search any ships they wanted, and more importantly, any homes that they wanted, on the pretense or suspicion that the owners of said ships or homes were engaged in smuggling. The colonists, for their part, protested, saying things like taxation without representation and the writs of assistance were blatant violations of the British Constitution and their rights as free-born Englishmen. In fact, the years from 1763, the end of the French and Indian War, and 1776, the signing of the Declaration of Independence, can be seen as a legal battle between the colonies and Parliament, where they argued over taxation and rights, yes, but also over much more fundamental issues such as justice and sovereignty. When no solution could be found, and it was made pretty clear that the only solution London was interested in was one in which Parliament reigned supreme over the colonies, that's when the colonists threw in the towel, said to hell with that, and declared their independence. Today, when despotism and tyranny are thought about at all, honestly, they're believed to be very specific commands against people, dictating where you can go, what you can do, what you can say, what you can buy, etc., etc. But the colonists in the 18th century understood these issues to be deeper than that. To go back to the issue of taxation as an example, the problem wasn't that Parliament was taxing the colonies, or even that there was a tax at all. The American colonies, FYI, were the least taxed of all the provinces of the British Empire in the 18th century. No, the specific problem, was taxation without representation. The American colonists understood this to be fundamentally unjust, the taking away not only of a man's livelihood, but also of his labor, his blood, sweat, and toil. And furthermore, it set a very dangerous precedent. After all, it was asked, if Parliament could get away with this unjust act, what other unjust acts would it try to enforce later on down the road? Injustice, in fact, was at the heart of the colonists' complaints against the mother country because it was inherently understood by them that an unjust society was by necessity a tyrannical one, even if there weren't little men with huge mustaches and funny little hats dictating your every move. And the reason for that was because it was understood that justice was an essential component for a flourishing society. We've mentioned before here on the channel how the primordial ingredient for a society to just exist is order. But the element that it needs to actually flourish and thrive is justice. And to understand why that is, we have to spend just a little time with one of my superheroes, the Greek philosopher Aristotle. Aristotle talks the most about justice in his Nicomachean Ethics, in which he breaks justice down into its different parts. He says that justice is composed of a narrow part and a broad part, the narrow part having to do with proportionality and equality, by which he means, for example, that we cannot treat someone differently than how his actions dictate we should treat him. A man, for example, who steals a loaf of bread can't be treated differently just because he's the mayor's son or is related to the chief of police. Broad justice, on the other hand, has to do with lawfulness. Now, when we hear that word today, we probably automatically think about laws. Duh. But when Aristotle uses the term, he means something deeper than mere legality. By lawfulness, the philosopher means laws, yes, but he also means customs and rules, what the ancient Greeks called nomos. In the pre-Socratic era, nomos meant a cutting off of some natural freedoms for communal self-interest. But the problem was this made the law too arbitrary and coercive, which is why philosophers like Aristotle and Plato argued that nomos shouldn't be based on what was simply socially useful, but on reason, which would allow eternal standards of morality to be discovered and then enshrined in laws, in rules, and in customs. What this means is that ultimately, justice is an intellectual virtue that binds a community with nomos for the attainment of its ultimate end, which Aristotle said was happiness. Now, to be clear, Aristotle did not have our postmodern understanding of happiness as his definition. And to be honest, this topic deserves a whole video of its own, but suffice to say for now, happiness, as it has been classically defined in the West, is not doing whatever one wants whenever, but is actually the alignment of the self with one's telos, or one's purpose and end. From what's been said up to this point, we can see now why justice is so fundamental for civilization. Without it, we are left in an arbitrary set of circumstances where raw power alone determines what's right and what's wrong. And hint, what's right and what's wrong will always depend on the predications of the people wielding that raw power. This means not only that we won't have the environment required for human flourishing, but that even our very lives won't be guaranteed. When raw power is the only thing you need to justify whatever you want to do, the sky's the limit. And furthermore, because there's no justice, there is absolutely no chance or hope for appeal. There is no shield whatsoever between you and the people actually wielding that raw power. That's actually ultimately why the American colonists signed on to the Revolution. When King George refused to even open the Olive Branch Petition, which was an 11th hour direct appeal from the colonists to the king, begging him to rein in his ministers and to exert his influence over Parliament for the protection of their rights as free-born English subjects, they knew that they were all alone. They could either decide to submit to the injustices that were becoming more and more common, or they could fight. And they ultimately chose the latter because they knew, as Winston Churchill would say not quite 200 years later, that it is better to fight and die than to live as slaves. When a society no longer believes in and promotes justice, that is when revolution is justified. Which means that the $64 question is, has our society actually reached that point? And unfortunately, gang, my answer to that question would be yes. Look, for example, at what happened this past weekend in DC at the MAGA Million March for President Trump. Marchers had their hats and flags stolen by counter-protesters and set on fire right in front of them. Marchers had eggs thrown at them. Marchers were even physically attacked, even if they were black, and even after the march was over. And these people from all over the country, ordinary Americans, peacefully exercising their right to assemble and protest, were just trying to get a bite to eat, bands of roving leftists roamed the streets, throwing lit firecrackers into their midst. Or look at Portland, Oregon. This past year, Portland had over 100 consecutive nights of violence. Statues being pulled down, businesses being looted and burned, federal buildings, public property being attacked and vandalized, even law enforcement officers being attacked by mobs in homemade armor. But the real villains, Mayor Ted Wheeler wants us to know, are people who have more than 6 people at their Thanksgiving Day table. If you have more than 6 people at your home for that very American holiday, you're going to have the cops put on your tail. Or look at this past election where shenanigans, the official term by the by, were clearly put in place for a Biden win. 325 counties across the country having higher voter turnout than registered voters is not an accident. With all the organs, systems, and institutions that matter in our society pushing the totalitarian lie that this was a fair and free election won fair and square by China Joe. Or, even better, look at the examples that are not quite so obvious. Look, for example, at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, which has announced that students will actually be able to report their fellow students for, quote, incidents that discriminate, stereotype, exclude, or harass an individual, or make someone feel, quote, feel unsafe, uncomfortable due to an incident. Even if these incidents don't violate UNL's Code of Student Conduct, and better yet, even if these incidents were completely unintentional. Look, for example, at the UC Berkeley English prof's public declaration on Twitter that Abigail Shrier's book on how transgenderism is hurting girls should be burned, which is the same book, by the by, that Target completely removed from its stock after receiving one complaint from a social justice warrior on Twitter. Look at society's zealous promotion of drag queen story time, refusal to protect unborn babies, even when said unborn babies can live outside of the womb, and the indoctrination of children as young as 5 and 6 into the sexual revolution headfirst. Look at the incessant attacks on the family, masculinity, femininity, innocence, history itself. Look at what is now society's default position, which says that if you are a white person, you are an oppressor, even if you're just a kid. And then look at the smug responses that you are the bigoted oppressive problem if you so much as dare raise a hand up in mild protest. Gang, justice was tossed into the gutter a long time ago. It is my conviction that if the founding generation were brought into 2020 via Doc Brown's DeLorean or that old black magic, they would be amazed. Not at our technological prowess, or at the fact that someone like Miley Cyrus could become a superstar. They would be amazed, actually, that we would have lived so long in such an unjust society. Remember, their spider senses exploded when Parliament tried to pass a tax on them, which today would literally be a couple of pennies. They would ask us today what our excuse is for living under these conditions for so long. And that is a really good question and some good food for thought. But as always, what say you? I would love to hear your thoughts, ideas, and opinions on this particular topic in the comment section below. Well, that about wraps up everything for right now, gang. Before you go, if you could give the video a like, share it with your friends on social media, and leave a comment, I'd be very much obliged. And like I said at the beginning, YouTube is now hiding my channel. So if you are interested in videos that look at the culture, politics, and religion from a unique POV, subscribe and make sure to ring that bell so that you will always receive notifications when I post new videos like this every week. As always, thank you for watching, for giving me a little bit of your day, and thank you to everyone who has already subscribed. I appreciate every single one of you, especially during these trying times. And until next time, gang, stay safe, stay free, by daring to read, think, speak, and write. I'll catch you next time. Ciao.